Today guys, I'm going to be taking a look at the New York Times review of The Wandering Earth 2, 流浪地球2, alongside some of the other worst reviews it has received. Now this is a film that I reviewed in my previous video and I myself gave it an extremely high score. I thought it was a very exciting, dynamic, blockbuster action film that had a underscoring of great tension in its emotional scenes, in its light-hearted scenes, with overall messages that were actually quite relevant and tied to today's politics, but without being too on the nose and direct. That being contrasted to the first film, which I noted in my review, I personally did not enjoy. Now this film has actually been received really well by both Western moviegoers and Chinese moviegoers, and its scores on the user-generated review websites of International Movie Database and Douban both reflect the film being warmly received, with scores of 8.0 and 8.2 respectively. Not only that, on the popular website Rotten Tomatoes, that is both a critic review site and a user-generated score, its verified audience reviewers have given it a score of 96%, but as you can see, this sits in stark contrast to the overall average score of critiques, which sits much significantly lower at 76%. Now this difference in scores that we can see has led me on to the main point of this video, which is to have a look at some of the worst reviews of The Wandering Earth 2. One that has particularly picked up a lot of comments online is the New York Times article, which actually started a trend on Weibo, which is 纽约时报酸味拉满差评流浪地球2. So today I want to take a look at this review from New York Times, along from two other extremely poor reviews of The Wandering Earth 2, just to review and assess the critiques and see if they are well placed or see if they disagree with my personal experience. Now, before we start, I want to say that anybody reviewing a film, it is a subjective process. A film is a piece of artwork, and so what I consider to be good and you consider to be bad is not a fixed permanent thing. There is no ability for us to debate on it in a logical or rational way. There is nothing I can say that would devalue what it is you are saying, because your experience of a film is completely subject to your internal personality, your outlook on the world, your experiences, the preferences you have for the things that you enjoy. And so what I want to point out is, when I'm reviewing these articles, and I most likely think I will be critical of them because I have a positive impression of the film and they clearly have a negative impression of the film, I'm not doing this to say that this person is wrong. This person cannot be wrong, because a film critique is subjective. I can't dictate to them what their experience of the film is. And so this video is said with no hate. I completely respect their opinion, and I hope they will respect my opinion, countering what it is I think of their opinion. I would also point out that these reviews have garnered some attention online for just being overtly negative, and some people have responded in an emotional manner. And I would also like to point out, generating an emotional response online is not an indication that what you've written is definitely untrue. That being said, shall we take a look at the articles and see just what it is they said? So first up, we have the Wandering Earth 2 review. It wanders too far, from the New York Times, and this is written by a gentleman called Brandon Yu. The subtitle is: the audacious sequel to Frank Guo's 2019 sci-fi blockbuster follows survivors working to avert planetary disaster, but it loses much of the glee of its predecessor. Well, if you've watched my review of the second film, that is in stark contrast to my opinion. When I was putting heaps of praise on the second film, I contrasted it to the fact that actually I wasn't a fan whatsoever of the first film, and I was actually disappointed with it. So already I would be in disagreement with this subtitle. I thought that it was markedly better than the first film, and I note that many other people have mentioned this. He goes on to say, the film was entertaining, but its ambitious scope had something of an empty gloss to it, partly because the story's drama wasn't grounded in anything beyond the showy cataclysm. Now I would say my personal opinion was that the show was grounded in two fundamentally human, emotional, individual relationships, and those were the relationship that Andy Lau had with his daughter and Wu Jing had with his wife. The film obviously was very broad in its ambitious nature to tell a story that was intergalactic. You know, it's about the Earth moving. It's not really related to one individual country, although obviously China leads as the main protagonist nation, but there were many different nations. There was the United Earth government. But the film, although it was large in its scope, also was rooted deeply in the individual relationships, human relationships of these two characters. So for me here to say that it wasn't deeply rooted in anything, it wasn't grounded in anything beyond the show's cataclysm, I don't think that's accurate. I thought particularly Andy Lau's relationship with his daughter that went on to be Yao Yao, the artificial intelligence, I thought there was a real intense, emotional, poignant story there that was underpinning the larger cataclysmic environment. He says that the film was an audaciously messy sequel that lost the glee of its predecessor. It was 3 hours of convoluted storylines, undercooked themes, and a tangle of confused, glaringly state-approved political subtext. Now, talking about the messiness of it, that was actually something that I appreciated. I do agree that the film was 3 hours of an incredible amount of information for the audience to take on board. The film was set at such a pace that often during the movie, I was struggling a little bit to define what was going on. The passage of time was very quick. It was across a span of about 100 years. There's a lot of different storylines to take on. There was cyber terrorism. There was, failures of a different range of projects in order to save the Earth. There were different characters interacting on different timelines. The film was going back to the past and to the future and all these different types of things. I actually thought that added to the layer of entertainment, and the reason that I say that is it created a sense of tension, a sense of mystery, a sense of unknowing in my mind that meant that the film was really engaging, and my inability to fully comprehend what was going on was actually a reason why I was continually drawn in. Now, whether it was glaringly state-approved political subcontext, I do think to a certain degree there was obviously a narrative in there where China as the protagonist nation, the major nation that was involved in the film's context, was showed in a positive light. But I think it was such an inconsequential backdrop to the film. The film's core themes were that of the United Nations. It was that of cooperation between nations as a earthly planet to go out and resolve the crises that it was facing. Now, there were other nations that were in the film that were shown in a positive light, and actually the interaction of the nations was mostly shown in a constructive way. Now, a criticism that I can think of is that there was no Chinese character that was shown in a negative light whatsoever. But I think that's normative within the film industry. If you think of, say, for example, my nation, Britain, it's James Bond films. Initially, James Bond and every British character that is in all of those classic films will be showed in a positive light. And the antagonist is always going to be from a nation that typically we might be distant from the UK, so a Russia, a Korea, an Iraq, these types of things. Now, the modern versions of these films, actually often because the audience has already consumed decades of the James Bond archetype, actually writers need to make it dynamic and refreshing and make it new, and so often they might turn it on the head, and some of the British characters might be evil, or some of the characters that you would normally expect to be evil are actually good, and vice versa. Now this, as the article notes, is one of China's first domestic sci-fi blockbusters, so it's still perfectly acceptable to my mind and congruent within the story that all of the Chinese characters were shown in a positive light. You can't fundamentally get away from the basics of the film's production and the film's target audience. It's a Chinese film from a Chinese sci-fi author, mainly produced to sell high tickets in China. It's perfectly normal and normative, just like Hollywood films, British films, Indian films. The large proportion of those characters is going to be shown in a positive light. Certainly initially, when the film industry matures 20, 30 years down the line, so a Chinese audience is a little bit, we've seen loads of Chinese characters saving the world, maybe they want something fresh, maybe at that time you'd expect there to be a negative portrayal of a domestic character. But I think to say that it was glaringly state-approved political subtext, I am somebody that, because I have an interest in China, I've watched programs such as 人民的名义 or 觉醒年代. If you want to go and see glaringly state-approved political subtext, they're the documentaries, dramas, TV shows that you need to go and see. I think on the spectrum of political subtext or propaganda, this was very, very, very low. It was an acceptable amount. It was an expected amount. Now, something I do just want to add as a caveat to that, Occasionally, the American characters were shown in an almost comedic way that did play to some preconditioned stereotypes, but it wasn't the major part of the American characters. And the fact is, within a story, within any story ever written, there's always a protagonist and there's always an antagonist. You can't get away from that, otherwise you create a dull, boring story. The author said it sets up flimsy ideas about dystopian geopolitics, man versus machine, and the nature of human consciousness. Now, I don't know why he says that's flimsy. I thought the raising of those issues was actually a really interesting nod to the crises that we are actually facing as humans as well, but they weren't overplayed. The 3 hours of the film was still pretty much an action film. It was still very thrilling, but it also had those subplots of political questions and societal questions that we need to resolve, not just China, America, Britain, but as a global humanity. I thought when it raised issues such as AI, automation, or whether we want to go and have a digital life after we die, it brought it up in a very nuanced way, which is actually reflective of how humans and society today are looking at this issue. We all know of the incredible benefits that artificial intelligence, that automation, that digitalization, that quantum computing are going to bring to our life. But we worry about things like, are we going to be able to control AI? Is automation going to lead to huge human unemployment? Is digitalization going to facilitate and speed up wealth inequality? Is continually expanding the lifespan of humans so that they put their mind onto digital products so that they can live forever? Moral, ethical, the right thing to do? You know, these are all the questions that we're facing right now, and I thought the film touched on them. Like I say, in a nuanced way. It didn't necessarily show them in an absolute negative or an absolute positive way. Both of these things were represented. For example, automation, we saw within the film, automation was actually a fundamental part of why they were able to achieve the success of the projects that they did, because it allowed them to speed up building of the Earth engines. But also we saw it caused riots because the workers were complaining about job losses. And so I thought it encapsulated the complexity and nuance of these issues in a very good way, but also that was sat behind the main driving force of the story, which was the action thriller about, are we going to be able to save the Earth? And also the emotional underpinnings of these characters. You know, was he going to be able to reconnect with his daughter in AI? Was he going to be able to save his wife that was dying of cancer? Was going to be able to raise his son, etc, etc. The critique then goes on to finish by saying the film had a silly narrative and that it tripped over an armful of melodramatic plot lines and conspicuously nationalist messaging, leaving you left wishing you'd saved the mindless fun in the first time round. I actually thought, if we're talking about mindless fun, I thought this film was absolutely designed for what I call the TikTok or Douyin generation. Video making, as it's evolved from us watching videos mainly on TV and at the cinema to now we watch them on YouTube or video sharing platforms, to predominantly now we're also starting to watch them on our phones where we swipe through them. The nature of video making and music making has changed to support our shortening time span. So let me give an example of that. The generation of musicians that exist now know to front load the most interesting parts of their songs at the start of the song. That was not the case when the Beatles were around. When the Beatles were performing for the radio, they would have a start that would build and build and build to the middle of the song, and that would be the most exciting part, because they knew that people were listening predominantly via the radio and they weren't going to be able to switch off, because people just didn't switch the radio all the time. It was something that you listened to at work or in your home. You didn't have the capacity to be switching it all the time. Today's generation of artists, when they're making music that is predominantly successful from going through streaming sites such as Spotify, they have to front load their song. So they put the most dynamic and interesting parts of the song within the front of the song to make sure that, boom, it grabs your attention and you continue listening and you don't switch off. I thought this film was demonstrative of the fact that the TikTok nature our shortening attention span is having on every medium of entertainment we choose to consume. I really thought that this film was just so fastly paced, it was so dynamic, it was so in your face, it was so engaging all of the time, that actually it felt overpacked with information. There wasn't really chance, particularly the first hour, for you to breathe. So when he talks about mindless fun, I thought this was an example of mindless fun. There weren't really passages of time where the film pace slowed significantly to engage you in a more developed and deep, artful in a sense of how we traditionally might think of an artful film. It was just 3 hours of boom, 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 pulsating, heart pulsating, attention grabbing. Even when the film did slow down to show the more human, emotional scenes, it was still incredibly tense. So I actually thought this was a really fun film. It was a TikTok-tized film. It just grabbed your attention and just wouldn't let you go. Whether it had a conspicuously nationalist message, I think you've got to judge it against its peers and its relation to other content out there. I mean, ultimately, the main thrusts of the film were about a united Earth government. It was about a global cooperation to overcome some of the challenges that we're having. I don't think you have an understanding of content if you think that one of the main takeaways from this is it was really nationalistic. I think you have to understand any nation is going to have within its art a nationalist part of it. It's perfectly normal for you want to create stories that show your country in a positive light. But I think if you were to assess the degree of the nationalist message within this film, I think it was fairly subtle. I feel like it wasn't a main driver of the film. I don't think it was significant to take note. I think if I look back across some of the films from my own country, if you wanted to look at them with the most critical eye, I'm sure you could find like huge amounts of nationalistic underpinning. Now that's not to say there weren't moments that didn't show China in a positive light. Obviously they did. But I think if you wanted to flip it on its head, you could say there were also moments that showed China in a kind of bleak way. There were moments where China was completely submerged by water. You know, some of its most iconic landmarks had essentially been destroyed. There was the criticism of, why is the Beijing Center not online yet? So I just think this is a bit wishy-washy in terms of a criticism. It doesn't really stand up for me. Wow, I've actually spent more time than I initially intended to on this review. I was planning on looking at The Guardian as well, which is from my own country. It gave the film 2 out of 5 stars, which again to me is shockingly low. I haven't had time. Perhaps I'll do that for another video if you would like me to and this film gets well received, then I will do. I just want to finally say again, the Brandon Wu, the film critic that has written this, is perfectly within his right. I think critiquing of art, whether it's film, video or music, is an entirely subjective process. It's one of the beauties of being a human, and when you ask the question, what is life and what is the reason for it, surely your individual and unique criticism and critique and enjoyment of art is that. So Brandon Wu, this film critique from the New York Times, I want to say he's perfectly within his right to critique a film. I don't think he should receive any negativity on his person as a result of it. That being said, I think it's perfectly acceptable to go out and check whether his review resonates and is congruent with the experience that I had, and I think largely it isn't. And it is curious to me that as a professional film critique, it could be so disjointed with what the audience feels about. Now I would also like to say this is perfectly common. This happens quite frequently in the modern world, where TV and film critiques will often review a product and think that it is fantastic or think that it's awful, and the audience won't agree. I think this might speak to the nature of how in the modern day you need to create engaging reviews, and what that normally means is you either have to be extremely praising or extremely critical. It's very difficult to be middle ground and to ensure that people actually want to listen to what you say. So I wonder if sometimes critics fall into this bit of a career trap, where there is a certain amount of pressure on them to exaggerate their views either to exceptionally positive or exceptionally negative. It's difficult to take the middle ground, because as we can see, regardless of whether it's in China or it's globally, the scores across Google Reviews, International Movie Database, Douban, Rotten Tomatoes are all really high for what is an enjoyable film. Right, then that wraps it up for today. 如果你喜欢这个视频，请给我们点赞。Please give me your review and your comments in the bottom. Which parts of the article did you agree with? Which parts of the article did you disagree with? And yeah, I shall see you next time. Bye bye.